Before he became the Duke of Edinburgh, before the world came to know him as Queen Elizabeth II's steadfast companion for more than 70 years, Prince Philip walked a very different path. A path shaped by exile, loss, and a quiet search for belonging long before destiny placed a crown beside his name. Most people know Philip as the strong, disciplined naval officer who married a young princess destined to be queen. They know the public man, the uniform, the ceremonies, the unwavering presence at Elizabeth's side. But almost no one knows about the boy he once was. The lonely teenager, moving between relatives, countries, and shattered worlds. The young man who longed for stability, and found it, briefly, in the warmth of a girl whose name barely survived the edits of royal history. To understand this story, we must return to the 1930 seconds, a Europe still decorated with the echoes of old empires, yet trembling beneath the early rumblings of war. Royal families still existed, but many were fractured, displaced, or fading. The Greek royal family, to which Philip belonged, was one of the most unstable of them all. Philip was born a prince without a real homeland. His family was exiled when he was an infant. His father lived far away. His mother struggled with her own battles. And his sisters, the people he trusted most, married into German aristocracy, scattering across Europe. He grew up in an environment where nothing was permanent. Schools changed. Homes changed. Even the adults in his life seemed fragile, unpredictable, or distant. And so, from an early age, Philip learned to present a hard shell to the world, a shield made of humor, discipline, and a fierce independence. But beneath that shell, there was a longing rarely seen by anyone. A longing for connection, for warmth, for someone who would see him not as a royal exile or a future naval officer, but as a young man with hopes, fears, and a heart capable of deep loyalty. And that is why the moment he met Amélie, the young noblewoman whose presence felt like calm sunlight cutting through a storm, something shifted in him. Their early encounters were modest. Visits between extended families, shared dinners, quiet afternoons in gardens, where conversations flowed easily and without formal constraints. Philip was used to being judged, evaluated, measured. But around her, he found something new: gentleness. She asked about his dreams. She listened when he spoke. She treated him not as a displaced prince, but as a person. And in those simple gestures, a soft and delicate affection began to grow. It was never a grand romance painted across newspapers or whispered in royal hallways. It was private, unspoken, almost fragile, the kind of young love that blooms quietly without ever knowing that history is preparing to sweep it away. For years, the royal archives, palace biographers, and official storytellers left this chapter out. Not because it was scandalous, but because it didn't fit neatly into the destiny the world already knew would unfold. But before Queen Elizabeth, before duty shaped every beat of his life, Philip felt something real for a girl who reminded him what home could feel like. But who was she? And how did a girl from a minor European noble house become the first person to touch Philip's heart before the future queen ever entered his story? To understand the significance of this quiet, hidden love, we have to step into the world of Princess Amélie of Hesse, the young noblewoman whose presence offered Philip something he rarely found: peace. Amélie did not belong to one of Europe's great ruling dynasties. She was not a queen in waiting, nor a political pawn destined for royal alliances. Instead, she came from a respected but modest line of German nobility families who still held influence, culture, and refinement, yet lived far from the grandeur of imperial courts. She was raised in an environment steeped in etiquette, literature, and music. Her childhood was shaped by quiet gardens, spacious family estates, and a lifestyle built around tradition rather than power. Amélie was known for her warm temperament, never the loudest in the room, but often the one people gravitated toward for her calm presence. Her world was orderly, structured, and deeply rooted, a stark contrast to Philip's world, which seemed to shift beneath his feet year after year. But despite the differences in their upbringings, their lives intersected in a way neither expected. During the summers of the mid-1930s, European nobility still maintained a practice of hosting gatherings, small dinners, musicales, and country visits where families mingled, strengthened ties, and preserved their place in an ever-changing social landscape. During one of these gatherings, Philip and Amelie first crossed paths. There was no dramatic moment of instant romance, no whirlwind of passion. Instead, their bond grew in the softest way possible, through familiarity. She spoke to him with gentleness, a tone he seldom heard in his chaotic upbringing. When Philip talked about his schooling in England, his frustrations, or the instability of his family, she didn't respond with judgment or pity. She listened with sincerity, offering warmth that made him feel seen. Many who later reflected on that period described Amelie as someone who had the ability to make people feel safe simply by being present. For Philip, a young man who had lived in the shadows of uncertainty, she represented something precious: stability. Even conversations between them were different. Where most people asked him about titles, duty, or his exiled family, Amelie asked about his interests, his aspirations, the things that made him laugh. There were moments, small, delicate ones, that hinted at a deeper connection. A shared smile over a private joke during a family dinner. Quiet walks through the garden of a summer residence while the adults talked politics inside. The exchange of letters through mutual relatives, filled with observations of daily life rather than royal expectations. These were not dramatic events, but they were meaningful, especially for a boy who had spent most of his youth drifting between households, never knowing where he truly belonged. Some historians quietly acknowledged that Philip looked forward to those visits more than he admitted. In later recollections, acquaintances noted the softening of his expression whenever her name surfaced, a subtle shift that hinted at affection deeply rooted in memory. A shared smile over a private joke during a family dinner. Quiet walks through the garden of a summer residence while the adults talked politics inside. The exchange of letters through mutual relatives, filled with observations of daily life rather than royal expectations. But the world around them was changing. And while their connection grew, Europe was stepping closer to the brink of war. Political tensions rose, royal families retreated behind their borders, and soon, even the simple act of visiting friends in another country would become a dangerous luxury. But destiny was not finished with Philip. A devastating tragedy was about to strike, one that would shatter the world he knew and forever alter the course of his life and theirs. To understand the depth of what Prince Philip lost, we must return to the cold autumn of 1937, the year destiny delivered a blow so devastating it would reshape his entire emotional world. At that time, Philip was a 16-year-old student at Gordonstown, trying to stabilize a life that had always felt scattered. The quiet affection between him and Amelie still lingered like a warm memory, delicate, unspoken, but real. Their connection had not blossomed into an official romance, yet the tenderness between them was undeniable, especially to those who saw how Philip changed whenever she was near. But on the evening of 16 November 1937, the fragile sense of normalcy Philip had begun to build crumbled in an instant. His beloved sister, Princess Cecile, the closest thing he had to a mother figure, was traveling with her husband, their children, and several members of their household. They boarded a flight from Germany to London, intending to attend a family wedding. The aircraft never made it. Somewhere above the fog-covered fields of Belgium, the plane attempted to land amid violent weather. It crashed into a factory chimney, erupting into flames upon impact. There were no survivors. News traveled slowly in those days. When Philip received the message, the world around him seemed to fall silent, not with peace, but with a crushing emptiness. He had already lost so much in his young life. But this was different. Cecile was the sister who protected him when he felt abandoned. She was the one who wrote him letters, who reminded him he still had family, who urged him to stay strong when the rest of the world felt unsteady. Her death was not merely a tragedy. It was the emotional anchor of his youth being ripped away. For days, Philip barely spoke. Witnesses later recalled a boy who looked much older than 16 standing stiff, pale, and hollow-eyed as he walked behind the coffins at the funeral in Darmstadt. The flight's devastation had taken not only his sister, but her husband, their children, and with them, the last stable part of Philip's early life. And far away, Amelie mourned as well. Cecile had been a bridge between their families, their gatherings, their summers, their shared quiet moments. All of it had flowed through the gentle bonds Cecily helped maintain. Her death shattered more than Philip's heart. It shattered the world in which his connection with Amelie could exist. War clouds were gathering. Borders were tightening. The fragile network of European royal families was beginning to crumble under the weight of ideology and conflict. Letters became harder to send. Visits became impossible. Safety became uncertain. As Philip tried to survive emotionally, the environment around him grew even more hostile. Germany was becoming dangerous for noble families like Amelie's. Movement was restricted. Communication was watched. Fear seeped into everything. Philip, meanwhile, threw himself into discipline, into the Navy, into training, into building a future where he would never again be powerless. His laughter became sharper, his personality more guarded. His resilience hardened like steel under pressure. It was during this storm of grief and transformation that the delicate connection with Amélie quietly dissolved, not through conflict or choice, but through tragedy and circumstance. There was no farewell letter, no final conversation, just silence, the kind that settles between two people whose lives are suddenly being pulled in different directions by forces far beyond their control. For Philip, the loss of his sister and the quiet fading of his first love left a wound he never spoke of openly. It became one of the hidden chapters of his heart, a memory folded carefully away, untouched by public eyes, overshadowed by the life he was destined to build. But fate wasn't finished with its twists, because just as Philip slowly rebuilt himself, there came a moment, brief, unexpected, when his and Amélie's paths nearly crossed again. As Europe emerged from the ashes of war, the continent began stitching itself back together in slow, delicate threads. Displaced families returned home. Aristocratic households reopened their salons and summer estates. Letters resumed their journeys across borders, carrying news, condolences, and hesitant hope. And somewhere within that fragile period of reconstruction, a faint possibility, the last echo of Philip's early affection, reappeared. By 1946, Philip had transformed. No longer the uncertain boy drifting between relatives, he had become a disciplined naval officer. He carried himself with confidence, shaped by years of military service, hardship, and personal rebuilding. His uniform brought him respect. His accomplishments brought him purpose. And his resilience brought him the admiration of those who once viewed him merely as an exiled prince without a future. Meanwhile, in Germany, Amelie's life had changed as well. Her family had endured the ravages of war, scarcity, fear, and the collapse of the world they once knew. Yet through it all, she grew into a composed young woman, marked not by tragedy, but by empathy and strength. Those who knew her said she was quieter than before, more introspective, as if the world's suffering had carved deeper wisdom into her gentle nature. Both of them had been reshaped separately, painfully, yet the emotional imprint they left on each other lingered, faint but intact. That year, members of several European noble families began organizing diplomatic gatherings aimed at restoring relations fractured by war. These were not grand balls or lavish ceremonies. Europe was too wounded for that. Instead, they were modest receptions, musical evenings, charity events, and cultural reunions held in rebuilt estates or modest town halls that had survived the bombings. Through mutual acquaintances, it was suggested that Philip might attend one of these gatherings in Germany or Switzerland. The idea was simple: a small reunion of young nobles who had been scattered by conflict, now stepping into adulthood with hopes of reshaping the future. Amélie was expected to attend, and those who exchanged letters with her noted that she seemed quietly hopeful, not with romantic expectations, but with the gentle anticipation of seeing an old friend who once brought warmth to her youth. For a brief moment, history stood still. It was the one window, small, fragile, precious, when their paths could have merged again. But destiny had already chosen a different trajectory. Because as these invitations circled between families, Philip received another request, one that would change the course of his life permanently. An invitation to Windsor. The British royal family wanted to host him. More specifically, Princess Elizabeth, now 20 years old, hoped to see him again. She had met Philip briefly years earlier, as a young girl, but the memory of the tall, blonde naval cadet had never left her. During the war, she had followed news of his service. She admired his discipline, his humor, the way he carried himself with understated strength. Elizabeth was not a girl anymore. She was becoming a woman preparing for her future role, and she saw something in Philip that resonated deeply. When Philip walked through the corridors of Windsor Castle that autumn, something subtle yet irreversible happened. Elizabeth's eyes never left him. Philip, unaware of destiny's quiet design, greeted her with respect, and those present later recalled that the young princess glowed not with royal decorum, but with unmistakable admiration. The British establishment noticed. Courtier noticed. Even the king noticed. And suddenly, Philip found himself at the center of a future far larger than anything he had ever imagined. The timing was absolute, unavoidable, perfect in a way only destiny can orchestrate. His potential reunion with Amélie quietly faded. Plan dissolved. Letters went unanswered, and the world gently folded away a love that was never allowed to reach its full form. Philip didn't push it aside cruelly. He simply stepped into the life that was calling him, a life intertwined with a young woman who would one day become one of the most iconic queens in modern history. But even as the world celebrated the future duke and future queen, a question lingered in the private corners of Philip's heart. Did he ever truly forget the girl who knew him before the crown? History remembers Prince Philip as the unwavering pillar behind Queen Elizabeth II, disciplined, sharp-witted, steadfast. But behind the public role, behind the uniform and the decades of duty, lay a man who had lived a life filled with profound losses long before he ever walked beside a queen. And among the memories he carried quietly, there was a chapter almost no one ever heard him speak of again. After Philip's visits to Windsor in 1946, his life accelerated in a direction shaped by destiny, duty, and monarchy. He renounced his Greek titles, embraced British citizenship, and stepped into a role few men in history have understood, a life permanently lived in the shadow of the crown. Elizabeth loved him with unwavering devotion, and Philip grew to love her deeply in return. Their marriage would become one of the most enduring partnerships the world has seen. But even the strongest partnerships do not erase the early stories written in the heart. Those who knew Philip closely, not the courtiers, not the public, but the handful of lifelong friends who saw him in private moments, often spoke of a side of him that the world rarely glimpsed. A softer, quieter Philip who carried a lingering sadness from his youth. A Philip shaped by grief, uprooting, and the loss of people he loved long before he ever met Elizabeth. And somewhere deep within that hidden emotional landscape was the memory of Amélie. He never spoke ill of the past, never dramatized it, never framed it as a tragic love lost. But friends noticed the way he reacted. Whenever conversations drifted toward his early years in Europe, the hesitations, the small pauses, the subtle smile that flickered like an old photograph in the mind. He would talk about Gordonstown, about the Navy, about his mentors. But when the topic shifted toward personal feelings or early companionships, Philip redirected the conversation with practiced elegance, not coldly but protectively. There were few things Prince Philip kept truly private in a life lived under scrutiny, but his youth and the tenderness it held remained one of them. Royal archivists noted something revealing after Philip's passing. Among his personal belongings, kept in drawers away from the public eye, were a small number of mementos from his earliest years in Europe. Letters, small trinkets, old notes, passed between families. Items insignificant to historians, but deeply significant to a young man who had spent much of his childhood without a stable home. No one confirmed whether any of those items were connected to Amélie, but several biographers quietly believed that they were, because Philip was not sentimental about objects. He kept only what mattered emotionally. And it is telling that memories from the exact period when he knew Amélie were preserved, while countless other pieces of his life were discarded without a second thought. Those who studied Philip's emotional journey have long suspected that Amélie represented something far more important than a forgotten romance. She symbolized the last moment in his youth when life felt gentle, before tragedy hardened him and duty reshaped him. Elizabeth brought him partnership, stability, and purpose. But Amélie, however, quietly had brought him something just as enduring. A glimpse of what it felt like to be simply Philip, not a prince, not a consort, not a naval officer, but a young man capable of being loved for who he was beneath the armor. He never saw her again. History carried them in separate directions. Her life unfolded far from the spotlight, while Philip's moved onto the global stage for 70 years. But some loves do not need grand endings. Some exist to teach, to soften, to illuminate a part of someone's soul before life demands they grow into something greater. For Philip, Amelie was not a lost love. She was a formative one, a quiet, emotional anchor during the stormiest years of his life. A love not erased, only buried. Beneath duty, beneath time, beneath the crown. Because even the most powerful figures in history carry a chapter they never meant the world to read, a chapter whispered only in the private corners of their hearts.